The conference room at Mitchell & Associates buzzed with the familiar energy of Monday morning team meetings. Fresh coffee steamed from paper cups, laptops clicked open with purposeful efficiency, and the large windows offered a view of downtown Seattle's skyline painted in morning light. 23 employees had gathered around the polished oak table, their faces reflecting the mix of ambition and caffeine dependency that defined corporate America. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. At the head of the table sat Regional Director Amanda Chen, her tablet already loaded with quarterly projections and strategic initiatives. She commanded the room with the kind of natural authority that came from 5 years of turning struggling divisions into profit centers. Today's agenda focused on the company's new Diversity and Inclusion Initiative, a program designed to leverage multicultural perspectives in their expanding international markets. Before we dive into the quarterly reports, Chen announced, tapping her stylus against the tablet screen, I want everyone to meet our newest team member. She'll be joining us as Senior Cultural Liaison for our European expansion project. The door opened with a soft click, and Maya entered with the kind of quiet confidence that some people mistook for uncertainty. She was perhaps 35, with dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail and wearing a charcoal gray blazer that looked professionally appropriate, but somehow different from the standard corporate uniform everyone else had adopted. Her shoes were practical flats, rather than the clicking heels that usually announced arrivals in this building. What struck people first wasn't her appearance, but her stillness. While everyone else fidgeted with phones, adjusted papers, or made small talk, Maya simply took the empty chair at the far end of the table and folded her hands in front of her. No nervous energy, no eager-to-please smile, just a calm presence. Maya will be working directly with our Frankfurt and London offices, Chen continued, bringing her extensive experience in cross-cultural communication to help us navigate the complexities of European business practices. The polite applause that followed lasted exactly the appropriate length of time. Professional, measured, the kind of welcome that said we're glad you're here, without committing to anything more substantial. Maya nodded once in acknowledgement, her expression neutral and attentive. Maya, would you like to tell everyone a bit about your background? Chen asked, settling back in her chair with the expectant look of someone who'd already reviewed the resume and found it impressive. Maya's voice, when she spoke, carried no trace of regional accent. It was clear, precise, and completely unplaceable. I've spent the last 12 years working in international consulting, primarily focused on helping American companies establish operations in European markets. I speak 6 languages fluently and have lived in 14 different countries during that time. The response was appropriately impressed murmurs and a few raised eyebrows. International experience was currency in this room, and Maya had just announced herself as potentially wealthy in that regard. 14 countries, repeated Jake Morrison, the team's lead strategist, with the kind of casual interest that preceded a more pointed question. That's quite a resume. What's your home base when you're not traveling? The question seemed innocent enough, the kind of getting-to-know-you inquiry that people made in professional settings. But something in Maya's pause, barely perceptible but definitely present, suggested the answer wasn't as straightforward as the question implied. I maintain residences in several locations, she said carefully, depending on current project requirements. Morrison nodded, but his expression suggested he'd noticed the non-answer wrapped in professional language. He was the type who prided himself on reading between lines, on catching the details that others missed. Sure, but originally, where are you from? Your accent is interesting. I can't quite place it. Maya's composure remained unchanged, but something shifted in the room's atmosphere. The question had moved from professional courtesy into personal territory, and everyone sensed it, even if they couldn't articulate why. I've lived in many places, Maya replied, her tone remaining perfectly even. It tends to blur the distinctions. Come on, laughed Sarah Kim, the marketing director, with the kind of persistent friendliness that some people used as a social crowbar. Everyone's from somewhere originally. I mean, what does your passport say? Quote. The silence that followed lasted perhaps 3 seconds too long. Not enough to be awkward exactly, but sufficient to make everyone suddenly very aware that they were waiting for an answer that seemed to be taking more consideration than it should require. Maya reached for the water glass in front of her, took a measured sip, and set it down with deliberate precision. I carry several different travel documents, depending on the requirements of specific assignments. Morrison leaned forward slightly, his interest clearly piqued by what he perceived as evasiveness. Several passports? That's unusual. Most people have one, maybe two, if they're dual citizens. What's your primary citizenship? The room had gone quiet now, not with the comfortable silence of people listening to a colleague's introduction, but with the focused attention of a group sensing that they'd stumbled onto something more complex than expected. Maya's refusal to give a simple, direct answer was beginning to feel less like privacy and more like mystery. My documentation allows me to work legally in any country where my services are required, Maya said, maintaining the same calm tone she'd used throughout the conversation. The specifics tend to be less important than the practical applications. But that's not really answering the question, pressed Kim, her friendly persistence taking on a slightly sharper edge. We're just trying to get to know you. Where did you grow up? What country do you call home? Maya's hands remained folded on the table, her posture unchanged, but several people noticed that her breathing had slowed slightly, as if she were consciously managing her responses. Home is wherever I'm currently working, she said simply. The answer was beginning to sound like a deflection, and the atmosphere in the room shifted accordingly. What had started as casual curiosity was evolving into something that felt more like interrogation, though no one seemed entirely sure how they'd arrived at that point. Look, Morrison said, his tone taking on the patient reasonableness that people used when they thought they were being helpful. We're not asking for state secrets here. It's just normal conversation. Everyone else in this room could tell you exactly where they were born, where they went to school, what their background is. It's not complicated. He gestured around the table as if to demonstrate his point. Sarah's from Portland, went to Oregon State. I'm originally from Phoenix, did my MBA at Northwestern. Tom grew up in Boston, Chen's from San Francisco. See? Normal biographical information that people share when they meet new colleagues. Maya nodded as if she understood completely, which somehow made her continued silence on the topic even more noticeable. I appreciate everyone's interest in getting to know me, she said. I prefer to focus on professional qualifications rather than personal history. The response was perfectly reasonable and completely unsatisfying. Kim exchanged a quick glance with Morrison, the kind of look that passed between people who'd identified a puzzle they intended to solve. It's not about being nosy, Kim said, her voice carrying just a hint of frustration wrapped in professional courtesy. It's about building relationships with our team members. Understanding people's backgrounds helps us work together more effectively. Absolutely, agreed Morrison, warming to the theme, especially in your role as cultural liaison. How can you help us understand international perspectives if we don't understand your own cultural background? The logic seemed sound, even compelling, but Maya's expression suggested she'd heard similar arguments before, and found them less persuasive than the speakers intended. My effectiveness comes from understanding multiple cultural perspectives simultaneously, she replied, rather than being limited to the viewpoint of any single nationality. But everyone comes from somewhere, insisted Tom Bradley, the financial analyst who'd been quietly listening until now. Even if you've lived all over the world, you still have roots, origins, family history, a place that shaped your early development. Maya turned her attention to Bradley, studying his face with the kind of careful attention that people usually reserved for documents they were trying to decipher. Origins can be more complicated than they appear, she said finally. The statement hung in the air like smoke, visible but impossible to grasp. Bradley frowned, clearly unsatisfied with what he perceived as continued evasion. How complicated can it be, he asked, his patience beginning to show signs of wear. You were born somewhere, you grew up somewhere, you went to school somewhere. These are basic facts, not complicated philosophical questions. Maya's pause this time was longer, more deliberate. When she spoke, her voice carried a quality that hadn't been there before. Not defensiveness exactly, but something deeper and more carefully controlled. Sometimes the basic facts are the most complicated part, she said quietly. The room had reached that point in a conversation where everyone knew they were discussing something important, but no one was entirely sure what it was. The original question about Maya's background had morphed into something larger and more unwieldy, like a simple knot that became more tangled the more people tried to untie it. Chen, who had been watching this exchange with growing unease, decided to intervene. "I think we should probably move on to the quarterly reports," she said, her tone carrying the subtle authority of someone redirecting rather than requesting. "Maya's qualifications speak for themselves, and we have a full agenda to cover." But Morrison wasn't ready to let the topic drop. "I'm sorry, but this is actually pretty important," he said, turning to address the room rather than Maya directly. "We're talking about someone who's going to be representing our company in international markets, and she won't tell us what country she's from. That seems like relevant information." Several heads nodded around the table. The logic was compelling, even if the persistence felt increasingly uncomfortable. Maya had become a puzzle that demanded solving, and the more she declined to provide simple answers, the more determined they became to find them. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Maybe she has security clearance issues," suggested Jennifer Walsh, the HR representative, trying to find a reasonable explanation for what seemed like unreasonable secrecy. "Some government work requires keeping personal information confidential." "Or maybe she's embarrassed about her background," offered Bradley, his tone suggesting he thought he was being helpful. "Some people feel self-conscious about coming from small towns or less developed countries. There's no shame in being honest about your origins." Maya listened to these speculations with the same calm attention she'd shown throughout the meeting, as if she were observing a discussion about someone else entirely. Her lack of visible reaction to increasingly personal theories about her motivations only seemed to fuel more creative explanations. "You know what I think?" Morrison said, leaning back in his chair with the satisfied expression of someone who'd solved a puzzle. "I think she's not actually qualified for this position, and she's hiding behind vague answers because she doesn't want us to check her credentials properly." The accusation landed in the room like a stone dropped in still water, creating ripples of discomfort that reached every corner of the table. It was one thing to be curious about a colleague's background. It was quite another to question their professional legitimacy in front of the entire team. Maya's expression didn't change, but something in her stillness shifted, becoming more pronounced, more deliberate. She looked around the table, meeting each person's eyes briefly before returning her attention to Morrison. "My credentials are available for verification through appropriate channels," she said, her voice carrying the same measured calm it had maintained throughout the conversation. "If there are specific concerns about my qualifications, I'm sure Ms. Chen can address them through proper procedures." It was a perfect professional response that somehow managed to make Morrison's accusations seem both inappropriate and unfounded without directly confronting him. The effect was to make him appear less insightful and more petty, which clearly wasn't the impression he'd intended to create. "I'm not questioning your qualifications," Morrison backpedaled slightly. "I'm just saying that basic transparency is part of building trust in a professional environment. And refusing to answer simple questions about your background doesn't build trust." Quote. Maya nodded as if she understood his perspective completely. "Trust is indeed essential in professional relationships," she agreed. "I hope to earn that trust through the quality of my work, rather than through personal disclosures that may not be relevant to our shared objectives." The response was diplomatically perfect and completely maddening. She had managed to acknowledge his point while simultaneously dismissing it, and done so in language that made any further pressure seem unreasonable. It was like trying to argue with smoke. There was nothing solid enough to grab hold of and shake. The meeting continued for another 45 minutes, covering quarterly projections, market analysis, and strategic initiatives, with the kind of detailed focus that corporate environments demanded. Maya participated appropriately, asking relevant questions and offering insights that demonstrated both intelligence and experience. Her contributions were thoughtful, practical, and clearly informed by extensive international experience. But underneath the professional discussion, the unresolved tension from the earlier exchange colored every interaction. People watched Maya more carefully now, listening not just to what she said but to what she didn't say, looking for clues that might unlock the mystery of her origins. When the meeting finally adjourned, Maya gathered her materials with the same methodical precision she'd shown throughout the session. No hurry, no apparent awareness of the scrutiny she'd attracted, just the calm efficiency of someone accustomed to navigating complex social and professional situations. As people filed out of the conference room, small clusters formed in the hallway, voices lowered to the conspiratorial level that corporate environments fostered when discussing colleagues who weren't present to defend themselves. "There's definitely something she's hiding," Morrison said to Kim and Bradley, his voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who'd identified a problem that others had missed. "Normal people don't dodge simple questions about where they're from." "Maybe she's in witness protection," Kim suggested, though her tone indicated she didn't entirely believe it herself. "That would explain the secrecy and the multiple travel documents." "Or maybe she's not legally authorized to work here," Bradley added, warming to the speculation. "That would explain why she won't talk about her citizenship status." Quote, the theories multiplied and evolved as they spread through the office, each retelling adding new details and interpretations. By lunchtime, Maya had become the subject of intense curiosity and growing suspicion, transformed from mysterious colleague to potential security risk through the alchemy of corporate gossip. Maya, meanwhile, had settled into her assigned office space with the same quiet efficiency she'd shown in the meeting. Her personal items were few and practical: a small plant, a framed photograph that faced away from the door, and a collection of reference books in multiple languages. Everything was arranged with military precision, functional rather than decorative. She worked steadily through the afternoon, reviewing market research and preparing preliminary reports with the kind of focused attention that suggested genuine expertise. Colleagues who passed by her office saw someone fully engaged in professional responsibilities, showing no signs of being affected by the morning's uncomfortable exchanges. But Maya was aware of the attention, the sideways glances, the conversations that stopped when she approached the coffee station or the copy machine. She'd experienced this pattern before, in other offices, in other countries, with other groups of well-meaning people who couldn't understand why someone would be reluctant to discuss their origins. The truth was more complicated than they imagined, and far more difficult to explain than they assumed. Maya had learned long ago that some stories were too complex for casual conversation, too painful for professional small talk, and too unusual for most people to accept without the kind of verification that she couldn't provide. So she continued working, answering the questions she could answer, and deflecting the ones she couldn't, hoping that her professional competence would eventually overshadow their personal curiosity. It was a strategy that had worked before, though not always quickly, and not always completely. The day ended as it had begun, with Maya packing her materials methodically and preparing to leave with the same quiet dignity she'd maintained throughout 8 hours of scrutiny and speculation. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new questions, and new opportunities to prove that professional worth could exist independently of personal disclosure. She had no way of knowing that her colleague's curiosity was about to evolve into something more determined, or that the simple question of her nationality was about to become a corporate obsession that would change everything. Tuesday morning arrived with Seattle's typical drizzle, the kind of persistent mist that made the city's glass towers disappear into gray clouds. The Mitchell & Associates building hummed with its usual energy, but today carried an undercurrent of focused attention that hadn't been there the day before. Maya's first day had left questions that overnight speculation had transformed into assumptions, and assumptions had a way of hardening into facts in corporate environments. Jake Morrison stood at the coffee machine on the 15th floor, steam rising from his ceramic mug as he stirred an artificial sweetener with mechanical precision. His conversation with Tom Bradley had the low, confidential tone that people used when discussing sensitive topics in public spaces. "I did some research last night," Morrison said, glancing around to ensure their privacy. "Tried to find any trace of her online. Social media, professional profiles, news articles, anything." Bradley raised an eyebrow, his own coffee forgotten as he leaned closer. "And?" "Nothing. Complete blank. In today's digital world, that's not just unusual, it's practically impossible. Everyone leaves traces somewhere. LinkedIn profiles, college alumni lists, professional conference speakers, something. But Maya? It's like she didn't exist before yesterday." The observation carried weight in their world, where professional credibility was often measured by digital footprints and verifiable online presence. The absence of such traces didn't prove anything definitively, but it raised questions that fed into growing suspicions about Maya's background and qualifications. "Maybe she uses a different name professionally," Bradley suggested, though his tone indicated he was grasping for reasonable explanations. "Some people have stage names or pen names for their careers." "That's what I thought initially," Morrison replied, warming to his detective work. "But Chen introduced her as Maya, and she didn't correct it or indicate it was an assumed name. Plus, if you're hiding your real identity, why take a job that requires security clearance and background checks? The logic seemed sound, even compelling. They were intelligent people applying rational thinking to an irrational situation, trying to solve a puzzle with pieces that didn't seem to fit together in any conventional way. Sarah Kim joined them at the coffee station, her arrival perfectly timed to catch the tail end of their conversation. "Are you two still talking about our mysterious new colleague?" she asked, pouring herself tea, with the kind of careful attention that suggested she'd been hoping to join this exact discussion. "Jake couldn't find any online presence for her," Bradley explained, bringing Kim up to speed. "No social media, no professional profiles, no digital footprint at all." Kim's expression shifted from curiosity to concern. "That's actually kind of troubling. In our line of work, we deal with sensitive client information, financial data, strategic plans. How can we trust someone who's essentially a ghost online?" The question crystallized fears that had been forming since yesterday's meeting. Trust was currency in their business, and Maya's reluctance to provide basic personal information was beginning to feel less like privacy and more like deception. "There's something else," Morrison added, lowering his voice further. "I talked to Jennifer in HR. Apparently, Maya's hiring process was expedited through some kind of special authorization. Normal background checks were waived because of her unique circumstances and, quote, classified previous positions." The phrase classified previous positions landed in their conversation like a stone in still water, creating ripples of implication that reached far beyond its simple meaning. In their world of corporate consulting, classified work usually meant government contracts, military applications, or intelligence community connections. "So she could be CIA," Kim said, her voice carrying a mixture of excitement and apprehension. "Or NSA, or some other three-letter agency. Or she could be someone trying very hard to make us think she has those kinds of credentials," Bradley countered, his natural skepticism asserting itself. "It's not difficult to create an aura of mystery around yourself, if you're willing to be vague enough about the details." Their speculation was interrupted by the arrival of Maya herself, appearing at the coffee station with the same quiet presence that had characterized her introduction the day before. She moved past them with polite nods, selecting herbal tea from the selection with deliberate care. The three colleagues fell silent, suddenly aware that their discussion had been more conspiratorial than they'd intended. Maya showed no sign of having overheard their conversation, but her timing felt uncomfortably coincidental. "Good morning," Kim said, her voice carrying forced cheerfulness. "How was your first evening in Seattle?" Maya looked up from her tea preparation, her expression pleasantly neutral. "Productive, thank you. I was able to review the European market analysis reports and begin preliminary assessments for the Frankfurt expansion." It was a perfectly professional response that revealed nothing personal while demonstrating engagement with their business objectives. The effect was to make Kim's casual questions seem intrusive, while simultaneously highlighting Maya's dedication to work responsibilities. "Working late on your first day," Morrison observed, his tone suggesting either admiration or suspicion. "That's quite a commitment to the job." "The sooner I understand the project parameters, the more effectively I can contribute," Maya replied, stirring honey into her tea with measured movements. "Time zone differences make it advantageous to establish communication patterns with European contacts quickly." Again, the response was logical, practical, and completely uninformative about anything personal. Maya had perfected the art of answering questions in ways that provided information while revealing nothing meaningful about herself. "Speaking of European contacts," Bradley interjected, "do you have existing relationships with business leaders in Frankfurt? Personal connections that might facilitate our expansion efforts?" Maya paused in her stirring, considering the question with the kind of careful attention that simple inquiries didn't usually require. "I've worked with various organizations throughout Europe over the past decade," she said finally. "Professional relationships develop naturally through successful project completions. But do you have family connections there?" Kim pressed, sensing an opening in Maya's usual deflection tactics. "Cultural ties that go beyond professional experience?" The silence that followed lasted perhaps 2 seconds longer than comfortable conversation required. Maya completed her tea preparation, testing the temperature with a small sip before responding. My connections to European markets are based on professional competence rather than personal relationships, she said, her tone remaining even despite the increasingly pointed nature of the questions. Morrison exchanged a quick glance with Bradley, the kind of look that passed between people who'd identified a pattern they found significant. Maya's continued refusal to discuss personal connections was beginning to feel less like privacy and more like evasion. It's just that cultural authenticity is really important in international business, Morrison explained, his voice taking on the reasonable tone that people used when they thought they were being helpful. Clients want to work with people who understand their cultural context on a deeper level, not just someone who studied it academically. Maya nodded as if she understood completely, which somehow made her continued silence on the topic even more noticeable. Cultural understanding develops through extended exposure and genuine engagement, she agreed. Academic study alone is insufficient for meaningful cross-cultural work. The response acknowledged his point while simultaneously sidestepping it, a diplomatic technique that was becoming increasingly familiar to her colleagues. Maya had mastered the art of saying nothing while appearing to say everything, and the skill was both impressive and frustrating. "But where did you develop that extended exposure?" Kim asked, her persistence taking on a sharper edge. "What countries shaped your cultural perspective? What languages did you learn as a child versus as an adult?" Maya's teacup paused halfway to her lips, a momentary hesitation that several people noticed even if they couldn't interpret its significance. When she responded, her voice carried the same measured calm it had maintained throughout their interaction. "Language acquisition and cultural immersion occurred through various circumstances over many years," she said. "The specific sequence tends to be less relevant than the cumulative understanding that resulted." Bradley frowned, clearly frustrated by what he perceived as continued evasiveness. "But those circumstances matter," he insisted. "Did you grow up in a diplomatic family? Military family? International business family? These things provide context that helps us understand your perspective and expertise." Quote. Maya set down her teacup with deliberate precision, the small porcelain sound somehow more noticeable in the sudden quiet that had fallen over their corner of the break room. Other conversations continued around them, but their small group had created an island of tension that seemed to exist separately from the office's normal rhythm. "My family circumstances were complex," Maya said finally, her voice carrying a quality that hadn't been there before. Not defensiveness exactly, but something deeper and more carefully controlled. They don't translate easily into conventional categories. The phrase complex family circumstances opened new avenues for speculation while providing no actual information. Morrison leaned forward slightly, sensing vulnerability in what might have been the first personal detail Maya had offered since her arrival. "Complex how?" he asked, his tone gentler now, as if he were trying to coax information rather than demand it. "Divorced parents? Multiple relocations? Adoption? We're not judging, we're just trying to understand your background." Maya looked around their small circle, studying each face with the kind of careful attention that suggested she was weighing options rather than simply considering her response. When she spoke, her words came slowly, as if each one required individual evaluation. "Understanding my background requires understanding circumstances that most people haven't encountered," she said quietly. "It's not a matter of privacy or secrecy. It's a matter of complexity that doesn't fit easily into casual conversation." The statement was both revelation and deflection, offering the promise of explanation while providing none of the details that would satisfy their curiosity. It suggested that Maya's reluctance to discuss her origins wasn't arbitrary, but based on genuine difficulty in explaining circumstances that defied normal categorization. "Try us," Kim said, her voice softening with what seemed like genuine sympathy. "We're intelligent people. We work with complex international situations every day. Whatever your background involves, we can probably understand it if you're willing to explain." Maya's pause this time was longer, more deliberate. She seemed to be weighing not just whether to respond, but how much truth a casual break-room conversation could accommodate. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a note of resigned honesty. "Some people grow up with a clear national identity," she said slowly. "Clear citizenship, clear cultural heritage, clear answers to questions about where they're from. My situation was different. It's different." The partial admission created more questions than it answered, but it was the first crack in Maya's diplomatic armor that anyone had managed to create. Morrison sensed opportunity and pressed gently forward. "Different how? You mentioned carrying multiple travel documents yesterday. Are you saying you have citizenship in multiple countries? Maya shook her head slightly, a gesture that seemed to indicate the question itself was based on incorrect assumptions. Citizenship implies belonging to a country that claims you as its own, she said. That's not always as straightforward as people assume. Bradley frowned, trying to process the implications of her statement. Are you saying you're stateless? That you don't have citizenship anywhere? The word stateless hung in the air between them like smoke, visible but difficult to grasp. Maya's expression suggested that Bradley had identified something significant. But her response indicated the reality was more complicated than simple labels could capture. Legal status and personal identity don't always align neatly, she said carefully. Especially when circumstances involve political upheaval, geographic displacement, or bureaucratic complications that span multiple generations. Kim's expression had shifted from curiosity to concern. That sounds incredibly difficult, she said, her voice carrying genuine sympathy. How do you manage practical things like travel, employment, banking? All of that requires official documentation. Solutions exist for people with non-standard circumstances, Maya replied, her tone suggesting familiarity with systems and processes that most people never encountered. They're just more complicated than conventional pathways. Morrison was beginning to understand that Maya's situation was genuinely complex rather than deliberately mysterious, but his curiosity had evolved beyond simple professional interest. Can you tell us more about those circumstances? He asked. What created this situation for you? Maya looked around the break room, suddenly aware that their conversation had attracted subtle attention from other colleagues. People weren't openly listening, but the intensity of their discussion had created ripples in the office's normal social atmosphere. This isn't really the appropriate setting for that kind of discussion, she said, gathering her tea and preparing to leave. Some stories require more time and privacy than break room conversations allow. But you will tell us eventually? Kim asked, her voice carrying hope, mixed with frustration. I mean, if we're going to be working together closely, especially on international projects, it seems like understanding your background would be helpful for everyone. Maya paused at the edge of their circle, considering the question with the kind of careful attention that suggested multiple factors were involved in her decision-making process. Understanding will develop naturally through our work together, she said finally. Professional competence tends to be more revealing than personal history. With that diplomatic non-answer, Maya departed for her office, leaving behind 3 colleagues who were more confused and curious than they'd been before the conversation began. Her partial admissions had confirmed that her situation was genuinely unusual while providing no clarity about what that situation actually entailed. Well, that was enlightening, Morrison said sarcastically, watching Maya's retreating figure. Now we know that we don't know anything, and that not knowing anything is apparently more complicated than we thought. I actually feel sorry for her, Kim said, her voice carrying genuine sympathy. Whatever her circumstances are, they're clearly not simple or easy. Maybe we should give her space to share information when she's ready, instead of pushing for details she's obviously not comfortable discussing. Bradley nodded slowly, though his expression suggested continued skepticism. I understand the sympathy, but we still have legitimate professional concerns. If her legal status is complicated, that could affect her ability to represent our company in international markets. We need to know if there are restrictions or limitations that could impact our business relationships. The practical considerations were valid, even if they seemed cold in the context of Maya's obvious discomfort with personal questions. Their jobs required them to think about risk management and liability issues, and an employee with unclear legal status represented potential complications that couldn't be ignored. Maybe we should talk to Chen, Morrison suggested. She must have more information about Maya's background and qualifications. HR wouldn't have hired someone for an international liaison position without thoroughly vetting their legal status and credentials. Kim hesitated, torn between professional responsibility and personal sympathy. That feels like going behind Maya's back. If she's going to share information about her circumstances, shouldn't it be her choice when and how that happens? Normally, yes, Bradley agreed. But she's been given access to sensitive client information and strategic planning documents. If there are security concerns or legal complications we don't know about, that's not just her private business anymore. It affects all of us. The conversation continued for several more minutes, circling around questions that had no easy answers. Maya's partial admissions had confirmed that her situation was genuinely complex, while providing no clarity about what that complexity entailed or how it might affect their work together. By the time they returned to their respective offices, their curiosity had evolved into something more systematic. What had begun as casual interest in a colleague's background was becoming a coordinated effort to understand circumstances that might have professional implications for their entire team. Maya, working quietly in her office, was aware that her morning conversation had created new dynamics rather than resolving existing tensions. Her attempt to provide partial explanation had backfired, creating more questions while failing to satisfy the curiosity that prompted them. She'd faced similar situations before, in other offices and other countries, with other groups of well-meaning people who couldn't understand why someone would be reluctant to discuss their origins. The pattern was familiar, predictable, and inevitably painful. But Maya had learned long ago that some truths were too complex for casual conversation, too sensitive for workplace discussion, and too unusual for most people to accept without the kind of verification that she couldn't always provide. Her professional competence would have to speak for itself, just as it always had. The afternoon stretched ahead, with meetings, reports, and the normal rhythm of corporate life. But underneath the professional surface, questions multiplied and assumptions hardened, setting the stage for complications that Maya had hoped to avoid but had come to expect as an inevitable part of her carefully managed existence. By Wednesday, the Maya situation had evolved from casual curiosity into what could only be described as a corporate investigation. The 15th floor of Mitchell & Associates had developed an undercurrent of focused attention that employees could sense even if they couldn't articulate its source. Conversations paused when Maya entered rooms, resumed when she left, and continued in hushed tones that suggested conspiracy rather than simple workplace gossip. Jennifer Walsh sat in her HR office, reviewing personnel files with the kind of systematic attention that suggested she was looking for something specific rather than conducting routine administrative work. Her desk was covered with documents that normally lived in secure filing cabinets, and her computer screen displayed databases that required special authorization to access. The knock on her door came at precisely 10:30 a.m., the scheduled time for what her calendar listed as a, quote, confidential personnel consultation, with no additional details. Morrison, Bradley, and Kim entered with the careful formality of people who understood they were initiating something that couldn't be easily undone. "Thank you for meeting with us," Morrison said, settling into one of the chairs across from Walsh's desk. "We have some concerns about our new team member that we thought should be brought to your attention through proper channels." Walsh nodded, her expression professionally neutral. She'd been expecting this conversation since Maya's hiring had been expedited through channels that bypassed normal HR protocols. Unusual personnel decisions had a way of generating questions that eventually required official responses. "What specific concerns?" Walsh asked, her pen poised above a legal pad. "Personnel matters require documentation, so I'll need details rather than general impressions." Bradley leaned forward, choosing his words carefully. Maya has been reluctant to provide basic biographical information about her background, citizenship status, or professional history. When pressed for details, she gives responses that seem deliberately evasive rather than genuinely informative. She claims to carry multiple travel documents, Kim added, but won't specify what countries issued them or what her primary citizenship status might be. For someone in an international liaison position, that seems like relevant information for her colleagues to understand. Quote, Walsh made notes as they spoke, her expression revealing nothing about whether their concerns were justified or excessive. "Have you asked her directly about these matters?" she inquired. "Multiple times," Morrison replied. She deflects questions about her nationality, her family background, her educational history, everything that would normally be part of getting to know a new colleague. Yesterday, she admitted her circumstances were, quote, complex, but wouldn't elaborate on what that means. She also mentioned something about not having clear national identity, Bradley continued, and implied she might be stateless or have some kind of non-standard legal status. That could have implications for her ability to represent our company internationally. Walsh's pen paused above her notepad. The word stateless carried legal and security implications that went beyond simple workplace curiosity. If Maya's legal status was genuinely unclear, that could affect her employment eligibility, security clearance, and ability to travel on company business. "Did she explicitly state that she's stateless?" Walsh asked, her tone sharpening slightly. Or are you interpreting vague comments in that direction? She said citizenship implies belonging to a country that claims you as its own, and that's not always straightforward, Kim replied, trying to recall Maya's exact words. When Bradley asked directly if she was stateless, she said legal status and personal identity don't always align neatly. She mentioned political upheaval, geographic displacement, and bureaucratic complications spanning multiple generations, Morrison added. But she wouldn't provide specifics about what any of that actually means in practical terms. Walsh reviewed her notes, comparing the colleague's account with information in Maya's personnel file. The discrepancies were troubling, not because they contradicted each other, but because they highlighted gaps in documentation that should have been resolved during the hiring process. I need to be clear about something, Walsh said, setting down her pen and addressing the 3 employees with careful formality. Personnel information is confidential, and I can't discuss details of any employee's background or documentation with their colleagues. However, I can tell you that Maya's hiring was approved through appropriate channels with full knowledge of her circumstances. What does that mean exactly? Bradley asked. Are you saying her legal status was reviewed and found acceptable? Or are you saying the company made an exception for circumstances that would normally be problematic? Walsh's pause suggested she was weighing how much information she could provide without violating confidentiality protocols. I'm saying that Maya's employment is legally compliant and professionally appropriate, she said finally. Beyond that, any concerns about her background should be addressed directly with her, rather than through speculation among colleagues. The response was diplomatically perfect and completely unsatisfying. It confirmed that Maya's situation was known to HR, while providing no clarity about what that situation actually entailed, or whether their concerns were justified. With respect, Morrison said, his tone becoming more formal, we're not engaging in idle speculation. We're raising legitimate professional concerns about someone who will be representing our company in sensitive international negotiations. If there are complications with her legal status that could affect those negotiations, we need to know. Especially if those complications could create liability issues for the company, Bradley added. We have fiduciary responsibilities to our clients and shareholders that go beyond individual privacy concerns. Walsh nodded, acknowledging the validity of their points while maintaining her position. Those concerns have been addressed at the appropriate organizational level, she said. If there were legal or professional issues that could affect the company's interests, they would have been resolved before Maya's employment was finalized. Kim shifted in her chair, clearly frustrated by the careful non-answers. Can you at least tell us whether she has security clearance for the kind of sensitive information she'll be handling? Some of our European expansion plans involve proprietary technology and confidential client data. Security clearances are handled through separate protocols, Walsh replied. If Maya has been given access to classified or sensitive information, that access was authorized through appropriate channels with full documentation of her credentials. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, circling around questions that Walsh couldn't answer and concerns that she couldn't directly address. By the time the 3 colleagues left her office, they had more confirmation that Maya's situation was genuinely unusual, while gaining no additional understanding of what that situation actually involved. Maya, meanwhile, was experiencing the subtle but unmistakable shift in office dynamics that accompanied being the subject of corporate investigation. Conversations stopped when she approached, resumed after she passed, and carried undertones that suggested she'd become a topic of systematic discussion rather than casual curiosity. She sat in the conference room for the weekly project review meeting, surrounded by colleagues who maintained professional courtesy while radiating barely concealed tension. The agenda focused on European market analysis, exactly the kind of discussion where her expertise should have been most valuable. But every contribution she made seemed to generate more questions than answers. Maya, your preliminary assessment of Frankfurt business culture mentions specific protocols for establishing trust with German financial institutions, said David Chen, Amanda's younger brother who handled technical implementation. Can you elaborate on the source of that information? The question seemed innocent enough, the kind of request for clarification that occurred in every business meeting. But Maya could hear the subtext, the careful probing for details about her background and experience that went beyond simple professional curiosity. German banking culture emphasizes relationship building over transactional efficiency, Maya replied, her voice maintaining the same measured calm she'd shown throughout her employment. Trust develops through consistent demonstration of competence rather than initial credentials or introductions. But how do you know that specifically? Morrison pressed his notebook open as if he were taking minutes, but his attention clearly focused on Maya's response. Is that based on academic research, consulting experience, personal relationships with German banking professionals? Maya paused, recognizing the trap embedded in what appeared to be a routine follow-up question. Any specific answer would lead to more specific questions, creating a chain of inquiry that would eventually reach topics she couldn't discuss openly. Professional experience with international banking protocols spans multiple markets and cultural contexts, she said carefully. German practices are consistent with broader European approaches to relationship-based business development. That's pretty general, Bradley observed, his tone carrying the patient persistence that suggested he was prepared to continue this line of questioning. For our expansion plans, we need specific guidance about establishing relationships with particular institutions. Generic cultural observations aren't sufficient for strategic planning. Maya nodded, acknowledging the validity of his point while preparing to deflect the specific information request. Effective relationship building requires understanding individual institutional cultures rather than applying broad generalizations, she agreed. Each bank, each regional office, each decision-maker brings unique perspectives that must be addressed individually. Right, but you must have worked with some of these institutions before, Kim interjected, leaning forward with interest. Can you share specific examples of successful relationship-building strategies you've implemented with German banks? The question was reasonable, professional, and impossible to answer, without providing the kind of detailed background information that Maya couldn't offer. She'd worked with German financial institutions, but the circumstances of that work involved government contracts, intelligence community connections, and diplomatic arrangements that existed outside normal business channels. Client confidentiality agreements restrict sharing specific details about previous engagements, Maya said, employing a standard consulting deflection that was both true and incomplete. However, general principles of relationship building apply consistently across cultural contexts. Morrison exchanged a quick glance with Bradley, the kind of look that passed between people who'd identified a pattern they found significant. Maya's continued deflection of specific questions was beginning to feel less like professional discretion and more like systematic evasion. Surely you can share something concrete, Morrison said, his voice taking on the reasonable tone that people used when they thought they were being patient. We're not asking for proprietary client information. We just want to understand the basis for your recommendations. Maya looked around the conference table, studying faces that reflected varying degrees of curiosity, suspicion, and professional frustration. These were intelligent people applying logical thinking to what appeared to be an illogical situation, trying to understand why someone would consistently avoid providing the kind of background information that normal business relationships required. My recommendations are based on cumulative experience across multiple markets and cultural contexts, she said, maintaining her diplomatic tone despite the increasing pressure. Specific examples might not translate effectively to your particular circumstances. But that's exactly why we need specific examples, Chen said, his voice carrying genuine confusion. How can we evaluate the relevance of your experience if we don't understand what that experience actually involves? The question crystallized the fundamental problem that Maya faced in every professional environment. Her expertise was real, extensive, and directly relevant to their needs. But it had been acquired through circumstances that couldn't be discussed in normal business settings. Government contracts, intelligence operations, and diplomatic missions existed in classified worlds that intersected with corporate consulting only at carefully managed boundaries. Experience evaluation occurs through practical application rather than historical review, Maya replied, recognizing that her answer would satisfy no one while being the only response she could provide. My recommendations will prove effective or ineffective based on implementation results rather than source credentials. Kim frowned, clearly frustrated by what she perceived as continued evasiveness. That's not how business relationships work, she said, her patience beginning to show signs of wear. We need to understand your background and credentials before we can trust your professional judgment. Trust develops through demonstrated competence, Maya countered, her voice remaining even despite the growing tension. Historical credentials matter less than current performance. But we can't evaluate current performance without understanding the foundation for your expertise, Bradley insisted. Where did you learn these cultural protocols? What institutions trained you in international business practices? Who can vouch for your experience and qualifications? The questions came faster now, a coordinated effort to pin down information that Maya couldn't provide without compromising security protocols that governed her previous work. Each deflection created more suspicion. Each diplomatic non-answer generated more determined questioning. Maya sat quietly for a moment, understanding that she'd reached a decision point that would define her relationship with these colleagues and this company. She could continue deflecting their questions, maintaining security while sacrificing professional relationships, or she could provide partial information that might satisfy their immediate curiosity while creating new complications. Some professional experience occurs in contexts that require ongoing confidentiality, she said finally, her voice carrying a note of weary honesty. Government contracts, diplomatic assignments, intelligence community work. These create expertise that can't be discussed openly even after the assignments conclude. The admission landed in the conference room like a stone dropped in still water, creating ripples of implication that reached every corner of the table. Maya had just confirmed what some had suspected, that her background involved classified work that explained both her expertise and her reluctance to discuss details. "So you worked for the government," Morrison said, his voice carrying satisfaction at having extracted a concrete piece of information. "Which agency? CIA? State Department? Defense Intelligence?" Maya shook her head slightly, indicating that his question itself was based on incorrect assumptions. "Classification levels and security protocols don't end when assignments conclude," she said quietly. "Some information remains restricted regardless of current employment status." "But you can tell us something," Kim pressed, sensing vulnerability in Maya's partial admission. "We're not asking for state secrets. We just want to understand your professional background enough to work effectively with you." Maya looked around the table again, seeing people who genuinely wanted to trust her professional judgment but couldn't do so without understanding the foundation for her expertise. Their frustration was understandable, their questions reasonable, and their confusion entirely justified. "I've worked in situations where normal identification and citizenship documentation created security risks," she said slowly, choosing each word carefully. "Those situations required alternative arrangements that don't translate easily into conventional business environments." Quote. Bradley leaned forward, recognizing that Maya was providing more specific information than she'd offered before. Alternative arrangements meaning what, exactly? Assumed identities? Diplomatic immunity? Witness protection? Meaning arrangements that allowed necessary work to proceed despite complications with standard documentation, Maya replied, providing clarification that somehow managed to be both specific and vague simultaneously. The meeting continued for another hour, but the dynamic had fundamentally changed. Maya's partial admissions had confirmed that her situation was genuinely complex, while providing just enough detail to fuel more sophisticated speculation about her background and current circumstances. By the time the meeting adjourned, her colleagues had moved beyond simple curiosity into active investigation. Maya's hints about classified work and alternative arrangements had created a puzzle that demanded solving, and they were determined to find answers through whatever means necessary. Maya gathered her materials with the same methodical precision she'd shown since her arrival, but she could feel the weight of increased scrutiny. Her attempt to provide partial explanation had backfired again, creating more questions while failing to satisfy the curiosity that prompted them. As she walked back to her office, Maya reflected on the familiar pattern that seemed to repeat itself in every professional environment she entered. Her expertise was valuable, her skills were relevant, and her contributions were needed. But the circumstances that had created those qualifications couldn't be discussed openly without compromising security protocols that governed her entire professional existence. The afternoon stretched ahead with more meetings, more questions, and more careful deflections of inquiries that seemed reasonable but touched on information she couldn't provide. Maya had learned to navigate these waters before, but each new environment brought fresh challenges and renewed hope that this time might be different. That hope was fading rapidly as she realized her colleagues' investigation was becoming more systematic and their questions more pointed. The revelation about classified work had raised the stakes considerably, transforming casual workplace curiosity into something that felt more like counterintelligence assessment. Maya settled into her office chair and opened her laptop, preparing to lose herself in the practical work that had always been her refuge from the complications of personal disclosure. Market analysis didn't require biographical information, strategic planning didn't depend on citizenship status, and professional competence could exist independently of personal history. At least, that's what she hoped. But the growing intensity of her colleagues' interest suggested that hope might be misplaced, and that the simple act of doing her job effectively was about to become significantly more complicated than she'd anticipated. Thursday morning brought an unexpected visitor to the Mitchell & Associates building. Dr. Elena Vasquez arrived at the reception desk at precisely 9 a.m., her credentials impressive enough to warrant immediate attention from the executive floor. Director of International Refugee Services for the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, Dr. Vasquez carried herself with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to navigating complex bureaucratic systems and sensitive political situations. "I'm here to see Maya," she told the receptionist, offering a business card that carried the distinctive blue UN logo. "She's expecting me." The receptionist's eyebrows rose slightly. Maya had been with the company for only 4 days, and she'd already attracted more high-level attention than most employees received in their entire careers. A UN official requesting a meeting was the kind of development that generated immediate phone calls to upper management. Within minutes, Amanda Chen appeared in the lobby, her expression carrying the careful professionalism that executives used when they weren't entirely sure what they were dealing with. "Dr. Vasquez, I'm Amanda Chen, Regional Director. I understand you're here to see one of our employees?" "Maya, yes," Dr. Vasquez confirmed, shaking Chen's hand with the firm grip of someone accustomed to establishing immediate credibility. "We have some administrative matters to discuss regarding her current employment status and documentation requirements." The phrase documentation requirements landed in the conversation with particular weight, given the questions that had been circulating about Maya's background and legal status. Chen nodded slowly, her mind already working through the implications of a UN refugee official conducting business with their newest employee. "Of course," Chen said, maintaining her professional composure while mentally rearranging her understanding of Maya's situation. "I'll have someone escort you to her office. Would you like coffee or anything else while you're here?" "Thank you, no, this shouldn't take long." Maya's office was located in the building's northeast corner, a modest space with large windows that offered views of Elliott Bay and the Olympic Mountains beyond. She'd arranged her workspace with the same methodical precision that characterized everything else about her, but the personal touches remained minimal. A small succulent plant, a world map marked with colored pins, and a single photograph that faced away from visitors. When Dr. Vasquez knocked on the doorframe, Maya looked up from her computer with an expression that suggested she'd been expecting this visit, even if she hadn't been anticipating it. The two women exchanged a look that carried the weight of shared understanding, the kind of recognition that passed between people who'd navigated similar challenges in different contexts. "Elena," Maya said, rising from her chair with genuine warmth, "thank you for coming." "Maya," Dr. Vasquez replied, stepping into the office and closing the door behind her with deliberate care. "How are you adjusting to corporate life?" The question seemed casual enough, but something in Dr. Vasquez's tone suggested it carried deeper implications than simple social courtesy. Maya gestured to the visitor's chair, settling back into her own seat with the careful attention of someone preparing for a conversation that required precision. "It's been educational," Maya said carefully, her voice carrying the diplomatic neutrality that had become her default mode in this environment. "American corporate culture has interesting dynamics." Dr. Vasquez nodded, understanding the subtext embedded in Maya's cautious response. "I imagine there have been questions about your background and documentation," she said, opening a leather portfolio that contained official-looking documents bearing various institutional seals. "Some curiosity, yes," Maya confirmed, her tone revealing nothing about the intensity of that curiosity or the professional complications it had created. People are naturally interested in their colleagues' backgrounds. "Of course they are, Doctor." Vasquez withdrew a folder from her portfolio, setting it on Maya's desk with the kind of careful attention that suggested its contents were both significant and sensitive. "Which is why I thought it might be helpful to clarify certain aspects of your situation for anyone who might have questions." Maya's expression shifted slightly, becoming more alert without losing its fundamental calm. "What kind of clarification?" "The kind that explains why a brilliant international consultant carries documentation from organizations that most people have never heard of," Dr. Vasquez replied, her voice carrying both sympathy and professional authority. and why that documentation is completely legitimate even though it doesn't fit conventional categories. Through the glass walls of Maya's office, several colleagues had noticed the presence of an unfamiliar visitor conducting what appeared to be official business. Morrison, Kim, and Bradley had positioned themselves at various points around the office floor where they could observe without being obvious about their surveillance. "Who do you think she is?" Kim whispered to Morrison, both of them pretending to review documents at a nearby workstation while keeping Maya's office in their peripheral vision. "Government official, definitely," Morrison replied, noting the visitor's formal attire and the way she carried herself. "State Department, maybe, or Justice Department. Someone with authority to discuss whatever Maya's situation actually involves." Bradley joined them with coffee cups that provided convenient props for their observation mission. "Did you see those documents she's carrying?" "Official seals, government logos, the kind of paperwork that suggests this isn't a social visit." Their speculation was interrupted by the arrival of Amanda Chen, who'd positioned herself in the hallway with a clear view of Maya's office. Her expression suggested she was wrestling with the same questions that occupied her employees, though her administrative responsibilities gave her more legitimate reasons for wanting answers. "Any idea what this is about?" Chen asked, abandoning the pretense that her presence was coincidental. "We were just wondering the same thing," Morrison replied, grateful that his boss had legitimized their curiosity. "Maya's been pretty secretive about her background, and now she's got UN officials making house calls. That seems like relevant information for people who work with her." Quote. Chen nodded slowly, her expression reflecting the tension between respecting employee privacy and managing potential security concerns. "I'll be interested to hear what this meeting reveals," she said carefully, maintaining plausible deniability while clearly expecting her employees to keep her informed about anything they discovered. Inside Maya's office, Dr. Vasquez had opened the folder and was reviewing documents with the systematic attention of someone conducting official business. "Your current employment represents exactly the kind of successful integration that our programs are designed to facilitate," she said, looking up from the paperwork. "But I understand there have been questions about your legal status and documentation." Maya nodded, her expression indicating both gratitude for Dr. Vasquez's presence and concern about the attention it might attract. "People have been curious about my citizenship and travel documents," she confirmed. "I've tried to maintain appropriate privacy while fulfilling my professional responsibilities." "Of course you have, but privacy becomes difficult when colleagues feel they can't trust someone whose background they don't understand." Dr. Vasquez selected a document from the folder, examining it carefully before continuing. Sometimes clarity serves everyone's interests better than discretion. "What kind of clarity?" Maya asked, though her tone suggested she already understood the implications of Dr. Vasquez's visit. "The kind that explains why your situation is both unique and completely legitimate," Dr. Vasquez replied, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to validating complex legal situations. "And why the people questioning your credentials might benefit from understanding what they're actually dealing with." Maya was quiet for a long moment, considering options that all carried various forms of risk. Complete disclosure would satisfy her colleagues' curiosity while potentially compromising the privacy she'd worked carefully to maintain. Continued deflection would preserve that privacy while making it increasingly difficult to function effectively in this environment. "What are you suggesting?" Maya asked finally. Dr. Vasquez smiled, the expression carrying both sympathy and professional confidence. "I'm suggesting that your colleagues might be more understanding than you expect, especially if they understood that your situation involves recognized international legal frameworks rather than deliberate evasion. And if they're not understanding, then you'll know you're working with people who aren't worth your time," Dr. Vasquez replied pragmatically. "But in my experience, most reasonable people can accept complexity once they understand its legitimate complexity rather than suspicious secrecy." Maya glanced toward her office windows, noting the subtle surveillance that her colleagues thought was discreet. Their curiosity had evolved into something more systematic, and her continued deflection was creating exactly the kind of suspicion that made effective professional relationships impossible. "What would you recommend?" Maya asked, turning her attention back to Dr. Vasquez. "I recommend honesty," Dr. Vasquez said simply. "Not complete disclosure of sensitive details, but enough truth to help them understand that your situation is recognized, legitimate, and actually quite remarkable." She withdrew another document from the folder, this one bearing the seal of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, along with multiple official stamps and signatures. This might help provide context for people who are having difficulty understanding your circumstances. Maya accepted the document, scanning its contents with the kind of careful attention that suggested she was seeing some of this information for the first time. Her expression shifted as she read, becoming more thoughtful and perhaps slightly surprised. "I didn't realize the documentation was this comprehensive," Maya said quietly. "We've been tracking your case for 15 years, Dr. Vasquez replied. "Your situation represents one of the most successful integration outcomes we've achieved, but it also illustrates why standard categories don't always capture complex realities." 15 years, Maya repeated, the number carrying weight that suggested personal significance beyond administrative record-keeping. 15 years since you first appeared in our systems, Dr. Vasquez confirmed. 15 years of building a life and career despite circumstances that would have defeated most people. That's not something to hide from. That's something to be proud of. Quote, Maya set the document on her desk, her expression reflecting the complex emotions that accompanied having one's entire adult life summarized in official terminology. Pride wasn't really the goal, she said quietly. Survival was the goal. Everything else just followed from that. Survival is an achievement, Dr. Vasquez replied with conviction. Thriving despite impossible circumstances is remarkable. Building expertise and contributing meaningfully to international business despite having no country to claim you. That's extraordinary. The phrase, "no country to claim you," hung in the air between them, crystallizing Maya's situation in language that was both precise and heartbreaking. Dr. Vasquez had just articulated what Maya's colleagues had been trying to understand, that her reluctance to discuss nationality wasn't evasiveness, but literal accuracy. "How much should I tell them?" Maya asked, her voice carrying the weariness of someone who'd made similar calculations many times before. "Enough to help them understand that your expertise comes from experience they've never imagined," Dr. Vasquez said. "Enough to explain why normal categories don't apply to your situation. Enough to make them realize they've been asking the wrong questions." Maya nodded slowly, understanding that Dr. Vasquez was offering her an opportunity to reframe the narrative that had been developing around her employment. Instead of remaining mysterious, she could become remarkable. Instead of being suspicious, her colleagues could become understanding. "And if this creates complications with my security clearances or employment status?" Maya asked, voicing the practical concerns that accompanied any decision to increase transparency about sensitive circumstances. "Your employment was cleared through appropriate channels specifically because your circumstances are recognized and documented," Dr. Vasquez assured her. "This conversation is about helping your colleagues understand what those appropriate channels already know and approve." The meeting continued for another 30 minutes, during which Dr. Vasquez provided Maya with additional documentation and guidance about how much information she could safely share with colleagues who were struggling to understand her background. When Dr. Vasquez finally prepared to leave, Maya had reached a decision that would fundamentally change her relationship with her coworkers. "Thank you for coming," Maya said, shaking Drive Vasquez's hand with genuine gratitude. "This has been clarifying." "That was the intention," Dr. Vasquez replied with a smile. "Your colleagues are about to learn something about the world that they didn't know before. That's always valuable, even when it's uncomfortable." As Dr. Vasquez gathered her materials and prepared to leave, Maya realized that the careful privacy she'd maintained since her arrival was about to end. The questions her colleagues had been asking were about to receive answers that would surprise them, challenge their assumptions, and possibly change how they thought about nationality, identity, and belonging. The afternoon stretched ahead with meetings, reports, and the normal rhythm of corporate life. But Maya knew that rhythm was about to be disrupted by revelations that would make everything that had happened so far seem simple by comparison. She looked at the UN documents on her desk, official validation of circumstances that most people couldn't imagine and few would ever experience. In a few hours, she would share enough of her story to transform mystery into understanding, suspicion into respect, and curiosity into something approaching awe. The decision felt both liberating and terrifying, offering the possibility of genuine professional relationships while risking the privacy that had protected her for 15 years. But Dr. Vasquez was right. Some truths were too remarkable to hide, and some colleagues deserved the chance to understand what they were actually dealing with. Maya spent the rest of the morning preparing for a conversation that would change everything while hoping her colleagues were ready to understand circumstances that defied everything they thought they knew about identity, nationality, and what it meant to belong nowhere while contributing everywhere. Thursday afternoon brought an unexpected email to the entire European expansion team. Maya had requested an all-hands meeting for 3 p.m. in Conference Room B, with the subject line reading simply, background information and moving forward. The message was brief, professional, and carried an undertone of finality that suggested significant developments were about to unfold. Conference Room B filled quickly as team members arrived with varying degrees of curiosity, apprehension, and anticipation. Morrison, Bradley, and Kim took seats near the head of the table, their notebooks ready and expressions reflecting the focused attention of people who expected to finally receive answers to questions that had been building for days. Amanda Chen positioned herself at the back of the room, maintaining the careful neutrality of a supervisor who needed to balance employee privacy with organizational oversight. Maya entered at precisely 3 p.m., carrying a manila folder that appeared to contain official documents, along with her usual professional materials. She moved with the same measured calm that had characterized her presence since arrival, but something in her bearing suggested that today's conversation would be fundamentally different from the careful deflections she'd maintained throughout the week. "Thank you all for coming," Maya began, settling into her chair with deliberate composure. "I've realized that my reluctance to discuss personal background has created professional complications that are affecting our ability to work together effectively. Today I'd like to provide clarity about my circumstances." The room's attention focused with laser intensity. After days of speculation, indirect questions, and diplomatic non-answers, Maya was finally offering the direct disclosure that everyone had been seeking. The silence was complete, expectant, and slightly electric with anticipation. "Before I begin," Maya continued, "I want to acknowledge that some of you have had concerns about my credentials, my legal status, and my ability to represent this company internationally. Those concerns are understandable given the limited information I've provided, and they deserve clear, honest responses." Morrison leaned forward slightly, his pen poised above his notebook as if he were preparing to document something significant. Kim's expression carried a mixture of curiosity and sympathy, while Bradley maintained the careful neutrality of someone who'd reserved judgment pending additional information. Maya opened her folder and withdrew several documents, arranging them on the table with the systematic precision that had become familiar to her colleagues. The papers bore various official seals, stamps, and letterheads that suggested government involvement at multiple levels. "My situation is unusual because I am what international law defines as a stateless person," Maya said, her voice carrying the matter-of-fact tone that people used when discussing technical subjects that happened to be personally significant. "I have no nationality, no country of citizenship, and no government that recognizes me as one of its citizens." The statement landed in the conference room like a small explosion, creating ripples of shock and confusion that reached every corner of the table. Several people exchanged glances, trying to process information that challenged fundamental assumptions about identity and belonging that most of them had never questioned. "What does that mean exactly?" Kim asked, her voice carrying genuine confusion rather than skepticism. "How is it possible to not have citizenship anywhere?" Maya had prepared for this question, understanding that most people's knowledge of statelessness came from movies rather than legal reality. "Statelessness occurs when someone falls through gaps in nationality laws," she explained patiently. "It can result from state succession, discriminatory laws, administrative failures, or, in my case, circumstances involving territorial disputes and failed diplomatic recognition." Bradley frowned, trying to fit this information into frameworks he understood. "But you were born somewhere," he said, his tone suggesting he was working through logical implications. "Every place belongs to some country. How can you not have citizenship in the country where you were born?" Maya's pause was brief but noticeable, suggesting that this question touched on particularly sensitive territory. "I was born in a region that existed as an autonomous territory under international administration," she said carefully. "When that administration ended and the territory was partitioned between neighboring countries, people like my family found themselves belonging to neither the departing administration nor either of the receiving nations." Morrison looked up from his notes, clearly struggling to understand the practical implications. "When did this happen? What territory are we talking about? The specific details involve ongoing diplomatic sensitivities, Maya replied, employing the careful language she'd learned for discussing classified information. But the general time frame was the late 1980s, when several regions experienced political transitions that created administrative gaps affecting civilian populations. Quote, Chen shifted in her chair, beginning to understand that Maya's situation involved geopolitical complexities that went far beyond simple immigration or citizenship issues. So you were a child when this happened? She asked. I was 7 years old when our family's legal status became unclear, Maya confirmed, her voice carrying a slight tremor that suggested personal pain beneath professional composure. Old enough to remember having a place we belonged to, young enough to grow up learning that belonging isn't something you can count on. The room had gone completely quiet, the kind of silence that accompanied revelations that forced people to reconsider fundamental assumptions about how the world worked. The idea that a 7-year-old could lose her country through bureaucratic and political failures was both heartbreaking and difficult to comprehend. What happened to your family? Kim asked softly, her earlier curiosity transformed into genuine compassion. Maya's hands remained folded on the table, but several people noticed that her breathing had become more deliberate, as if she were managing emotional responses while maintaining professional composure. My parents spent 15 years navigating legal systems, filing appeals, seeking recognition from various governments and international organizations. They died still fighting for documentation that would have allowed them to travel freely, work legally, or claim protection from any nation. The statement carried such matter-of-fact pain that it took several seconds for its full impact to register. Maya had just revealed that her parents had died stateless, spending their final years in legal limbo that most people couldn't imagine, and few governments were equipped to address. My God, Chen said quietly, her voice carrying the shocked understanding of someone beginning to grasp the scope of what Maya had experienced. How did you survive? How did you build a career without citizenship or documentation? Maya reached for one of the documents on the table, a thick folder bearing the distinctive blue seal of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. The UN Refugee Agency has protocols for people in situations like mine, she explained. After my parents died, I was classified as a person of concern under international protection frameworks. This provided access to specialized documentation and legal pathways that aren't available through normal citizenship channels. Quote, Bradley studied the UN document that Maya had placed where everyone could see it, noting the official stamps, registration numbers, and legal language that confirmed her status within recognized international systems. So you're officially recognized as stateless, he said, his tone shifting from skepticism to something approaching awe. This is actual legal documentation, not some kind of bureaucratic confusion. Statelessness is a recognized legal condition affecting approximately 12 million people worldwide, Maya confirmed, her voice taking on the educational tone that people used when sharing expertise about subjects most others had never encountered. The UN maintains detailed protocols for protecting and assisting stateless persons, including pathways for education, employment, and limited travel. Morrison looked up from the UN document, his expression reflecting a fundamental shift in understanding. All those questions we've been asking about your background, your nationality, your credentials, we were asking you to explain something that has no simple explanation. You were asking normal questions based on normal assumptions about how citizenship and identity work, Maya replied without defensiveness. Most people can answer, "Where are you from?" with a single sentence. For me, that question requires a lecture on international law and geopolitical history. Kim shook her head slowly, processing the implications of Maya's revelation. No wonder you were reluctant to discuss this at a coffee machine conversation, she said. How do you even begin to explain 15 years of legal limbo to people who've never imagined such a thing was possible? You don't, usually, Maya admitted. Most of the time, it's easier to deflect personal questions and hope that professional competence speaks for itself. But in environments where trust depends on transparency, that strategy creates more problems than it solves. Chen leaned forward, her expression reflecting both sympathy and growing understanding of the professional implications. Your expertise in international business, your language skills, your cultural knowledge, all of that comes from living this experience. Maya nodded, grateful that someone was beginning to understand the connection between her circumstances and her qualifications. When you don't belong anywhere, you learn to understand everywhere, she said simply. When normal documentation doesn't exist, You become expert at navigating alternative systems. When conventional pathways are closed, you develop creative solutions that most people never need to consider. That's why you carry multiple travel documents, Morrison said, pieces of the puzzle finally clicking into place. And why you deflected questions about your primary citizenship. You don't have primary citizenship. I carry a UN travel document, a certificate of identity from the International Refugee Organization, and specialized permits for specific countries where I've maintained long-term residence, Maya confirmed. It's more complicated than a normal passport, but it allows legal travel and employment in most international jurisdictions. Bradley was reviewing the documents Maya had shared, his expression shifting from confusion to respect as he began to understand the complexity of systems she'd mastered. This documentation is incredibly sophisticated, he observed. The legal frameworks, the international coordination, the bureaucratic processes. You've become expert at navigating systems that most people don't even know exist. Necessity creates expertise, Maya replied with a slight smile. When conventional approaches don't work, you learn unconventional ones. When standard documentation doesn't apply, you master alternative protocols. When normal categories don't fit, you become comfortable existing between definitions. Kim had been quiet for several minutes, processing information that challenged everything she'd assumed about nationality and belonging. I can't imagine what that must have been like, she said finally. Growing up without a country, watching your parents fight legal battles they couldn't win, building a life without the basic documentation that everyone else takes for granted. It was complicated, Maya acknowledged, understating circumstances that had shaped every aspect of her adult existence, but it also created opportunities that conventional paths might not have offered. When you can't rely on national identity or cultural assumptions, you learn to understand multiple perspectives simultaneously. When you can't depend on official credentials, you develop practical skills that speak for themselves. Chen was beginning to understand how Maya's circumstances had created exactly the kind of international expertise their company needed. Your cultural knowledge isn't academic or theoretical, she realized. You've lived as an outsider in multiple societies, learning to navigate different systems while belonging fully to none of them. Exactly, Maya confirmed. I understand how Germans think, because I've lived there long enough to internalize their cultural assumptions while remaining American enough to see their blind spots. I know how French business culture works because I've operated within it while maintaining the perspective of someone who doesn't take its logic for granted. Morrison set down his pen, realizing that his notes were inadequate to capture the complexity of what Maya was revealing. All those questions about your qualifications and credentials, he said, his voice carrying a note of embarrassment. You have qualifications that none of us could imagine acquiring because we've never faced circumstances that would require developing them. I wasn't offended by your questions, Maya assured him. They were reasonable inquiries based on normal expectations about professional backgrounds. I was frustrated by my inability to answer them simply, not by your curiosity about things that would normally be straightforward. Bradley had moved beyond processing Maya's personal circumstances to considering their professional implications. This explains why your market analysis has been so insightful, he realized. You're not just applying academic knowledge about European business culture. You're drawing on lived experience as someone who's had to understand these systems well enough to survive and thrive within them. Survival requires understanding, Maya agreed. When you can't depend on cultural insider status or official credentials, you learn to read social dynamics, business protocols, and bureaucratic systems with the kind of precision that most people never need to develop. Kim was studying the UN documentation with fascination, noting the complex legal language that governed Maya's status within international protection frameworks. This is like a completely parallel universe of legal systems and bureaucratic processes, she observed. Most people have no idea this exists. Most people are fortunate enough never to need it, Maya replied. But for those who do, these systems can mean the difference between legal existence and administrative invisibility. Quote, the meeting continued for another hour as Maya patiently answered questions about statelessness, international protection frameworks, and the practical realities of building a career without conventional documentation. Her colleagues asked about everything from daily logistics to long-term planning, trying to understand how someone managed practical life requirements that they'd never had to consider. By the time the meeting concluded, the dynamics in the room had fundamentally shifted. Maya's mysterious background had been transformed from suspicious secrecy into remarkable resilience. Her reluctance to discuss personal details had evolved from evasiveness into understandable privacy around circumstances that most people couldn't comprehend. "Maya," Chen said as the meeting wrapped up, her voice carrying both respect and slight awe, "thank you for sharing this with us. I realize it couldn't have been easy to explain circumstances that are so far outside most people's experience." "Thank you for listening," Maya replied, gathering her documents with the same methodical precision she'd shown throughout her employment. "I hope this helps explain why some questions don't have simple answers, and why my approach to international business might be different from conventional consulting perspectives." As colleagues filed out of the conference room, they carried with them a completely transformed understanding of their newest team member. The woman they dismissed as evasive and potentially unqualified had revealed herself to be someone who'd overcome circumstances that would have defeated most people while developing expertise that few others could match. Maya remained in the conference room for a few minutes after everyone else had left, sitting quietly among the documents that had finally allowed her to share her story. The decision to reveal her circumstances had been difficult, but Dr. Vasquez had been right. Truth was proving more powerful than mystery, and understanding was replacing suspicion. The afternoon sun slanted through the conference room windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny possibilities. Maya had taken a significant risk by sharing her story, but for the first time since her arrival, she felt like she might be able to build genuine professional relationships based on understanding rather than speculation. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities to prove that expertise could transcend conventional credentials. But today had marked a turning point where mystery had become clarity, suspicion had transformed into respect, and the question of where she came from had finally received an answer that her colleagues could understand and appreciate. Friday morning arrived with a transformed atmosphere at Mitchell & Associates. The 15th floor buzzed with a different kind of energy than it had carried all week. Still focused and professional, but now infused with something that felt like genuine respect rather than suspicious curiosity. Maya's revelation had rippled through the office overnight, creating conversations that went far beyond workplace gossip into deeper territories of understanding and admiration. Jake Morrison arrived at his desk earlier than usual, carrying coffee and a stack of international law articles he'd spent the previous evening reading. His computer screen displayed multiple browser tabs, UN refugee statistics, academic papers on statelessness, and news articles about territorial disputes that had created similar situations worldwide. What had begun as skeptical investigation had evolved into genuine education about global realities he'd never considered. Sarah Kim found herself reviewing Maya's preliminary market analysis reports with completely new appreciation. Details that had seemed generic the day before now revealed themselves as insights that could only come from someone who'd navigated these business cultures as both insider and outsider, understanding their logic while maintaining critical perspective that pure cultural membership wouldn't provide. Tom Bradley had spent his morning recalculating the value proposition that Maya brought to their European expansion. Her expertise wasn't just extensive, it was literally irreplaceable. The combination of practical experience, cultural fluency, and legal knowledge she had developed through circumstances that few people could survive made her uniquely qualified for international consulting work that required navigating complex bureaucratic and cultural boundaries. Amanda Chen called an impromptu executive meeting at 9 a.m., gathering the senior staff who'd been briefed on Maya's situation and needed to discuss its implications for their business operations. The conference room felt different than it had the day before, less tense, more purposeful, focused on opportunity rather than damage control. "I've been thinking about yesterday's revelations," Chen began, addressing Morrison, Bradley, Kim, and several other senior team members. "Maya's background represents exactly the kind of specialized expertise that our international expansion requires, but I'm concerned that we haven't been utilizing her knowledge effectively." Morrison nodded, his earlier skepticism completely replaced by professional excitement. "Her insights into European bureaucratic systems alone could save us months of trial and error navigation," he agreed. "And her understanding of alternative documentation frameworks could be crucial for clients who have their own complex international situations." "More than that," Bradley added, "her perspective on cultural adaptation could give us competitive advantages that conventional consultants couldn't provide. She understands business cultures from the viewpoint of someone who's had to master them for survival, rather than just professional advancement." Kim leaned forward, her expression reflecting both enthusiasm and protective concern. We need to be careful not to exploit her circumstances, she cautioned. Maya shared her story to improve our working relationship, not to become a case study or marketing advantage. We should respect the trust she's placed in us. Chen appreciated Kim's sensitivity while recognizing the business opportunities that Maya's unique qualifications represented. Absolutely, she agreed. But we can also acknowledge that her expertise is genuinely extraordinary and ensure she's given projects that utilize her skills appropriately. Underutilizing someone with her background would be wasteful for everyone involved. The meeting continued for an hour, focusing on restructuring Maya's role to better leverage her international expertise while respecting the personal circumstances that had created that knowledge. By the time they adjourned, Maya had been promoted from Cultural Liaison to Senior Director of International Strategy, with expanded responsibilities and compensation that reflected her unique value to the organization. Maya arrived at her office to find a small envelope on her desk, her name written in Amanda Chen's careful handwriting. Inside was a brief note confirming her promotion along with access codes for executive-level databases and international client files that would allow her to contribute more meaningfully to strategic planning processes. Before she could fully process this development, Morrison appeared in her doorway with an expression that mixed professional excitement with personal embarrassment. "Maya, do you have a few minutes? I wanted to apologize for some of the assumptions I made this week, and also discuss a project opportunity that might interest you." Maya gestured to the visitor's chair, noting that Morrison's entire demeanor had shifted from suspicious interrogation to respectful collaboration. "What kind of project?" she asked. "We have a potential client in Switzerland, a pharmaceutical company looking to expand into emerging markets in Eastern Europe," Morrison explained, settling into the chair with the enthusiasm of someone who'd found the perfect solution to a complex problem. They need someone who understands both Western business protocols and the bureaucratic realities of post-Soviet economic systems. Maya's eyebrows rose slightly, recognizing immediately why this project would require her specific expertise. Emerging markets in that region involve complex regulatory frameworks and cultural dynamics that most Western consultants find challenging, she observed. "Exactly," Morrison confirmed. "Standard business school approaches don't work when you're dealing with legal systems that are still evolving and cultural expectations that blend multiple historical influences." The client specifically requested someone with practical experience navigating these kinds of complex international situations. Maya understood that Morrison was offering her exactly the kind of project that would utilize her background constructively rather than treating it as an obstacle to overcome. "What would my role involve?" she asked. "Leading the entire consultation," Morrison replied. "Strategy development, cultural assessment, regulatory analysis, implementation planning, everything. The client wants someone who can understand their Western business culture, while also navigating Eastern European complexities that their internal team can't handle." The opportunity represented everything Maya had hoped to achieve when she'd accepted employment at Mitchell & Associates. Meaningful work that utilized her unique qualifications while contributing to legitimate business objectives. "I'd be interested in discussing the details," she said. "Great. There's one more thing." Morrison paused, seeming to gather courage for something he found difficult to express. "I want to apologize for the way I approached questions about your background this week. I was thinking like someone who'd never had to consider alternative pathways or complex documentation situations. Your patience with our ignorance was more generous than we deserved." Maya appreciated his honesty while recognizing that his assumptions had been reasonable, given his limited exposure to international legal complexities. "You were asking logical questions based on normal expectations," she replied diplomatically. "I was frustrated by my inability to answer them simply, not by your curiosity about things that would typically be straightforward." "Still, I learned something important about making assumptions," Morrison continued, "and about the difference between secrecy and privacy around circumstances that most people couldn't understand even if they were explained clearly." Their conversation was interrupted by Kim's arrival with what appeared to be official documentation. "Maya, I have news that you'll want to hear," she announced, her voice carrying excitement mixed with official formality. Maya accepted the documents Kim offered, noting immediately that they bore the seal of the United States Citizenship and Immigration Services along with several other governmental logos. Her expression shifted as she read, becoming more surprised and perhaps slightly emotional. "What is it?" Morrison asked, noting Maya's reaction to whatever information the documents contained. Maya looked up from the paperwork, her voice carrying wonder mixed with disbelief. "It's a letter confirming that my application for permanent residency has been approved," she said slowly. "After 15 years of temporary status and renewable permits, I've been granted the right to remain in the United States permanently." Kim smiled broadly, having been the one to coordinate with HR and legal departments to expedite Maya's residency application through proper channels. "Chen thought it might be helpful to have your legal status clarified officially," she explained. "Your UN documentation was sufficient for employment, but permanent residency opens up additional opportunities for both you and the company." Quote, Morrison was beginning to understand the significance of this development beyond its administrative implications. "You'll be able to travel freely for business purposes," he realized, "and take on projects that require security clearances or extended international assignments." Maya nodded, still processing the emotional impact of achieving legal status she'd been working toward for most of her adult life. "Permanent residency doesn't create citizenship," she clarified, "but it provides stability and opportunities that temporary status couldn't offer." "More importantly," Kim added, "it represents official recognition that your contributions are valued, and that you belong here professionally and personally, regardless of the complex circumstances that brought you to this point." The phrase "you belong here" carried particular weight for someone whose entire adult experience had been defined by existing between categories and outside conventional definitions of belonging. Maya's eyes brightened slightly, though she maintained the composed demeanor that had carried her through the week's challenges. "Thank you," she said simply, the words encompassing gratitude for far more than administrative assistance. The following Monday brought a different Maya to Mitchell & Associates, not fundamentally changed, but liberated from the careful diplomacy that had characterized her first week. Her interactions carried the relaxed confidence of someone who no longer needed to manage every conversation for potential security risks or personal exposure. The weekly team meeting focused on project assignments and strategic planning, but the dynamic had fundamentally shifted from suspicious investigation to collaborative partnership. Maya's contributions were received with the respect due to recognized expertise, rather than the skepticism that had marked her initial presentations. "Maya, could you walk us through your assessment of the Swiss pharmaceutical project?" Chen requested, settling back in her chair with the expectant attention of someone who knew the response would be valuable. Maya opened her laptop and projected a comprehensive analysis that demonstrated the full scope of her international expertise. "The client's expansion into Eastern European markets presents three primary challenges," she began, her voice carrying the authority of someone whose knowledge was now fully recognized and appreciated. First, regulatory frameworks in target countries reflect complex historical influences that require understanding post-Soviet bureaucratic evolution. Second, business cultures in these regions prioritize relationship building over efficiency metrics, in ways that Western companies often misunderstand. Third, legal documentation requirements involve international treaties and bilateral agreements that standard corporate legal departments aren't equipped to navigate. Bradley took notes as Maya continued, no longer recording her responses to check for inconsistencies but documenting insights that would inform strategic planning. "How do we address these challenges practically?" he asked. "We begin with cultural immersion rather than market analysis," Maya replied, warming to the subject. "I'll spend 2 weeks in each target country, not just meeting with potential business partners but understanding how local administrative systems actually function versus how they're supposed to function according to official documentation." Kim leaned forward with interest. "That's a completely different approach than our standard international consulting methodology," she observed. "Standard methodology assumes consistent rule of law and predictable bureaucratic processes," Maya explained. "In emerging markets, especially those transitioning between political systems, practical reality often diverges significantly from official procedures. Success requires understanding both the formal requirements and the informal protocols that actually govern business operations." Morrison was beginning to appreciate how Maya's background had created expertise that couldn't be acquired through conventional education or training. "Your experience navigating complex documentation requirements gives you insight into bureaucratic systems that most consultants would find impenetrable," he realized. "Exactly," Maya confirmed. "When you've spent years learning to work within systems that don't quite fit standard categories, you develop skills for understanding any system that operates outside conventional logic." Chen was calculating the competitive advantages that Maya's approach could provide. How long would this assessment process require, she asked. 6 weeks for comprehensive analysis. Another 4 weeks for relationship building and regulatory mapping, Maya replied. It's longer than standard consulting timelines, but it provides foundation for successful implementation rather than just theoretical strategic recommendations. And the client understands they're getting analysis that no other consulting firm could provide, Bradley added, recognizing the marketing value of Maya's unique qualifications. Maya nodded, but her expression suggested she wanted to address something beyond project logistics. There's something else I want to mention, she said, her tone becoming more personal. This week has taught me something important about professional relationships and the value of transparency, even when transparency is complicated. The room's attention focused on Maya, sensing that she was about to share insights that went beyond business strategy into more fundamental territory about trust and collaboration. For 15 years, I've managed my career by providing minimal personal information and hoping that professional competence would speak for itself, Maya continued. That strategy protected my privacy but limited my ability to build genuine working relationships with colleagues who needed to understand my background to trust my expertise. Kim was listening with particular attention, recognizing that Maya was articulating lessons that applied beyond her unique circumstances. Trust requires understanding, Kim agreed, even when that understanding involves learning about situations we've never encountered before. Especially then, Maya confirmed, your willingness to listen to circumstances that challenged your assumptions about nationality and identity allowed us to move beyond suspicion into genuine collaboration. That couldn't have happened if I'd continued deflecting your legitimate questions about my background. Morrison reflected on his own evolution from skeptical interrogator to respectful colleague. We learned something too, he admitted, about the difference between healthy curiosity and invasive investigation, and about recognizing when someone's reluctance to share information comes from complexity rather than deception. Chen was considering the broader implications of what had developed between Maya and her team. This experience has application beyond our specific situation, she realized. In international business, we often encounter people whose backgrounds don't fit conventional categories. Understanding how to build trust across those differences is crucial for effective collaboration. Quote, Maya appreciated Chen's recognition that her circumstances, while extreme, illustrated principles that applied to many cross-cultural business relationships. When you can't rely on shared cultural assumptions or conventional credentials, you learn to build trust through demonstrated competence and honest communication about what you can and cannot provide. Bradley was thinking about how this insight could improve their approach to other international projects. Most of our consulting methodology assumes that everyone involved shares basic cultural frameworks and legal status, he observed. Maya's experience shows us how to work effectively with people whose situations don't fit those assumptions, and how to recognize that non-standard backgrounds often create exceptional expertise rather than representing limitations to overcome, Kim added, understanding that Maya's circumstances had created capabilities that conventional paths couldn't provide. Maya gathered her materials as the meeting drew to a close, but her expression suggested she had one final observation to share. There's something I've learned from this week that applies beyond international consulting, she said thoughtfully. What's that? Chen asked. Everyone has circumstances that seem perfectly normal to them but might appear strange or suspicious to others who haven't shared similar experiences, Maya replied. The difference between building trust and creating conflict often depends on whether people are willing to listen with genuine curiosity rather than defensive judgment. The insight resonated through the conference room as people considered how Maya's perspective applied to their own assumptions about colleagues, clients, and anyone whose background differed from their expectations. My statelessness is unusual, Maya continued, but everyone navigates some kind of complexity that doesn't fit standard categories. Learning to recognize and respect those complexities creates stronger professional relationships and better business outcomes for everyone involved. Morrison nodded slowly, understanding that Maya was offering wisdom that extended far beyond her specific circumstances. You're saying that assuming everyone's situation is straightforward creates problems, while acknowledging complexity creates opportunities. Exactly, Maya confirmed, and that the most valuable team members are often people whose backgrounds have required them to develop creative solutions to problems that others have never faced. As the meeting concluded and colleagues returned to their respective offices, Maya remained in the conference room for a few moments, reflecting on the transformation that had occurred over the past week. Her decision to share her story had been risky, But it had created exactly the kind of professional relationships she'd hoped to build throughout her career. The afternoon sun slanted through the windows, illuminating the space where she'd finally found the courage to be honest about circumstances that most people couldn't imagine. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Dr. Vasquez. "How did it go?" Maya typed her response carefully. "Better than expected. Truth really is more powerful than mystery." Dr. Vasquez's reply came quickly. "It usually is. Proud of you for taking the risk." Maya smiled, gathering her materials and preparing to begin work on the Swiss pharmaceutical project that would utilize her expertise constructively, while building on the trust she'd established with colleagues who now understood her background. The week that had begun with suspicious questions about her nationality had ended with recognition that belonging didn't require conventional citizenship, expertise didn't depend on standard credentials, and trust could develop between people whose experiences differed dramatically if they were willing to listen with genuine respect for complexity they might never fully understand. Maya had finally found a professional home where her remarkable journey from stateless refugee to international expert was seen not as a liability to manage but as an asset to celebrate. And her colleagues had learned that their strongest team member was someone they'd almost dismissed because they couldn't understand that extraordinary circumstances often create extraordinary capabilities. Sometimes the most valuable people were those whose stories didn't fit standard categories, whose expertise came from surviving challenges that most others never faced, and whose contributions could only be fully appreciated by colleagues wise enough to recognize that difference didn't mean deficient, it meant irreplaceable. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.